Joy O'Keefe, and I am a bat biologist, and I study bats mostly in the eastern U.S. Adorable little red bats like this one, which is one of the bats flying over Cook County on September nights as it migrates to the south. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, some kind of bats 101. What are bats doing? Why should we be worried about bats? Then I'll talk to you a little bit about things that you could maybe do to help bats. And then finally, talk about an effort that we have to monitor bats across a large scale in North America, including sharing some data from Cook County and Illinois in general. So, you might wonder, why should you care about bats? Although I think for a group like this that you're pretty well versed in, being concerned about the natural world and understanding that, there's a value in protecting our biodiversity. First off, just for the sake of, protecting these animals, which have a right to coexist in the same space with us, but also because they provide important ecosystem services and are important parts of an ecosystem in terms of kind of trophic levels and interacting with other organisms. So when we think about bats, it sometimes the crazy bats like the vampire bat shown here kind of come to mind. So vampire bats are just one of many, many species of bats. Bats are really incredibly diverse. And this is just one of 3 species of vampire bats. And then there are over 1,400 other types of bats. And these are, just one of the great examples of bat diversity, because vampire bats are so unique. There's no other vertebrate that is exclusively drinking blood. So they're sanguinivorous, and they're able to process that diet and have some pretty interesting features. For example, vampire bats have a blood thinner like molecule in their saliva that helps them to keep blood flowing in their victims. And we've actually co-opted that compound and used it in treating victims of cardiovascular disease. So that's just one of the many ways that bats are really useful to us. But most bats are eating other things besides blood. So out of the over 1,400 species of bats that have been named so far, there are some really diverse diets exemplified, including insectivory, frugivory, eating fruit, nectarivory, so they're consuming nectar from plants or pollen, piscivores, which eat fish. We don't, to our knowledge, we don't have any fish-eating bats in Illinois, but that would be an interesting one that could be unearthed one day. And then there's even bats that are carnivores, eating birds, frogs, other bats. Of course, those kind of rich diets, more on there you can find bats eating just about everything. But as you can see from this list, the only thing that they're not eating that a lot of are also really diverse in terms of where they like to roost. And those 2 things make bats kind of unique, I think, compared to rodents. So rodents are the most diverse group of mammals. Oh, I forgot I was going to turn off my video so that I could make sure I had good internet here. So rodents are the most diverse group of mammals that exists, but bats are second. But when you consider all of these unique features that bats have, I think they're arguably more diverse. Most of our bats here in Illinois and in the Midwest and really around the world are arthropodivorous, meaning they eat arthropods. And most of their prey items fall into 3 insect orders. They're eating moths, flies, and beetles. And it turns out they're really not super selective about, what kind of moth or what kind of fly. It's more about the size, and that's probably driven by the size of the bat and what they can actually easily handle. But I say they're eating arthropods because sometimes we'll find them eating other things besides insects. For example, a lot of our bats are eating spiders. And then there are bats in the Western US that are known to eat scorpions and centipedes. So really, really diverse diets, and kind of able to take advantage of whatever's on the ground at night or in the sky. One of the benefits that bats are offering to us when they're eating these arthropods is that they're eating things that are pestilent to our crops, to our forests, and to us. So these pictures here show the top 5 kind of major dietary items consumed by 2 species of bats, the Indiana bat and the northern long-eared bat, which I will introduce you to here shortly. And the number 1 item on the top left is a crane fly. Now, crane flies are pretty innocuous. They're not harmful to people or to plants, really. They're a cousin of the mosquito. But next on the list, to the top right, is the mosquito. And of course, everyone knows that mosquitoes are pests to humans. And so this is something that we can be grateful that a lot of bats will eat mosquitoes. These bats also are eating tiny flies, like the midge fly in the bottom left. And midge flies are a type of biting fly that bites humans, also cattle. And so important to recognize the bats are taking those as prey items commonly. And then in the bottom in the center is a microlepidopteran. So by that, I just mean a small moth. And these moths can be predators basically of our plants, including our trees. And I'll tell you a little bit more about bats and insects and tree interaction later on. And so it's great that they're eating these things like oak leaf rollers and hickory moths and things like that. And then bottom right is a leaf hopper, and leaf hoppers are a type of true bug, and they actually pierce things and suck the juices out, including plants. And so 4 out of 5 of these top 5 prey items are things that are pests to either plants or to humans. Bats have also been shown to be important in controlling crop pests. You may have seen the statistic that bats are really vitally important to corn. They do consume the corn earworm moth, which is the same as the cotton bollworm down in Texas. And those moths can be pretty devastating for our crops. Now, we have engineered our crops so that they are less susceptible to those pests by producing GMO crops. And so where we're planting those, farmers are actually using a lot less pesticide and less dependent on bats. And that's typically our large scale agricultural operations, such as here in Illinois. We have, like in where I normally am in Champaign County, we have 90% of the county is corn and soy, but most of that is not sprayed for pests because of the fact that it's GMO crops. However, when we look at smaller scale operations, like where we're growing peaches or grapes or tomatoes or sweet corn for the farmer's market, for example, their bats are likely really vital to pest control. And there have been a number of papers that have come out relatively recently documenting this. So that's being done in a few ways. One is by just looking at the diets of bats. So we can take guano samples or poop samples from bats and actually extract the DNA, sequence it, and do, just in the past 10 years, the capabilities have exploded dramatically. So now we can do what we call metagenomic analyses, where we are able to basically identify all the DNA sequences in the sample. And then we blast those against a database where entomologists have kindly put up, the sequences of the insects that they've identified. And we can kind of do a matching game and figure out what exactly it is that bats are eating. And so by doing that, we've been able to figure out that bats are eating a lot of crop pests, including pests for these smaller scale crops. But we've also done some exclosure experiments where we keep bats out and we determine the impacts of excluding bats and how the plants are affected. And I'll tell you more about how my lab has done that with bats and forests a little bit later on. But we can definitely continue to do more work in this, including in the Midwest and Illinois. So one important thing to recognize about bats, I mentioned rodents earlier. is how distinct bats are from rodents. So bats are not flying mice. In fact, even though the Germans call bats die fledermaus, which means the flying mouse, that is certainly not true. Bats are the only mammal capable of true powered flight. Their distant cousin, the flying squirrel, is a type of rodent that is able to glide, but they are not, even 5% as cool as bats, because bats are able to maneuver in the air and, of course, catch insects in flight, whereas flying squirrels are merely, taking off from one surface and kind of gliding down to land on another surface. So not true controlled flight. Important to recognize about bats when we compare them to mice that bats have a remarkably slow life history. And what I mean by that is that bats can live a long time, and they give birth to just one or a few pups per year. So they're actually fairly long-lived and incredibly long-lived for their body size. So when we look at, sorry, the reason I have a picture of a bat here with a little red band on it is because by banding the bats, we are actually able to age them. It's incredibly difficult when you catch a bat to tell how old it is. All we know is that it's either the young of the year because of being able to see through their little joints and their wing bones, or we know that it's an adult. And beyond that, we don't know. But if we put a unique tag on the bat of some sort, then we recapture the bat later, then we will be able to determine how old they are. And from those, we have actually documented some really old bats. So this first paper up at the top documented that little brown bats, which are a common bat in Illinois, including, well, always have been a common bat in Illinois. They're declining a little bit now, but that they have the ability to live at least 18 to 25 years. And in fact, there was a documented little brown bat in Minnesota that was over 30 years of age. So that's incredibly long. And then, of course, they are also giving birth to just one pup per year. So that's a really slow life history, in contrast to rodents, which live for just a couple years usually and give birth to many, many, many pups during that time. But an even more incredible record is from Russia, where another bat in the same genus, Myotis, as the little brown bat, was documented at 41 years of age. And of course, marking the bats is what enables us to find that out. Important to remember that if you have bats in your backyard, that they may be coming back, the same exact bats, every year. We have found through marking bats that bats are incredibly faithful to their summer homes and their winter homes. So this map on the right side of the screen shows some data from a student that I worked with in Indiana, where we were catching bats at the area indicated by the star, which is a study site just southwest of Indianapolis. And then the bats were migrating to these caves, and there's 5 caves shown by these black dots, and the arrows just represent maybe a presumed migratory path, although we really have no idea. We're not able to track the bats as they move from one site to another very well. I have some colleagues that do that via airplane, but it's of course very expensive and not easy to do. But with the bands, we can say we put a band on a bat here, and then we re-observed that same bat in a hibernation site. And then now we know that they are moving between these sites. And so that's what these arrows indicate. And the bats will actually move back and forth between the same summer site and the same winter site. So you will frequently recapture a bat if you've banded it in a winter site or a summer site. And that gives us some evidence of their site fidelity. So much of the work that I do with bats is driven or kind of motivated by the fact that many species are in peril. And I'll talk a little bit more about the global threats to bats, but the 2 big things that are really forefront on a lot of people's minds are white nose syndrome and fatalities from wind energy. And so these are actually 2 titles of papers, one saying that white nose syndrome is likely to extirpate the endangered Indiana bat over large parts of its range. I can say that that is true. That has actually already happened. But in other places, the bat is doing okay, including here in Illinois and over next door in Missouri. Fatalities at wind turbines may threaten the population viability of a migratory bat that paper is referring to the hoary bat, which is the bat pictured there. And that is also true, although we have no idea what their population size is. We are seeing many, many of these bats dying at wind turbine sites. Threats persist across North America, but worldwide, when we look at threats to bats, habitat loss ranks really highest. We see that most bats are considered data deficient. We don't know much about them, but we see natural habitats disappearing globally. And we're not just talking about logging and then reforestation, which is often what's happening on our state and national forests, but instead just wholesale destruction of forested habitat, converting that forest into something else, like, for example, places to graze cattle. And harvesting of plants. So many bats have a tie with plants, have a strong relationship, using plants as roost sites or as foraging sites or both, that these impacts can be felt, across many species. Intensive agriculture. While we may not be spraying pesticides across our GMO crops across much of Illinois anymore, we are still taking that land that would have been natural habitat and using it for something entirely different. And it's a radically different landscape that is probably a lot less attractive to our bats than the prairies that used to cover so much of Illinois. Human disturbance is an issue. In some parts of the world, hunting can be problematic for bats. People actually eat bats in some places where there are bigger bats, but they also just hunt bats because bats are considered to be dangerous and kind of scary to a lot of folks who don't understand bats. Here in Illinois and worldwide, we still see issues with people intruding on bat habitats. So today, just this morning, I was able to go into 2 sites where bats hibernate here in southern Illinois, where I am right now. And we have gates across the entrances to these sites so that bats can come in and out, but people cannot. And we have to have a special key to remove a piece of the gate and actually get inside so that we can survey these sites. We were actually going in to put in temperature sensors, incidentally. And then, of course, urban development is an issue for bats because there we're taking up natural habitats, and that can be problematic as well. So just diving into this a little bit more in terms of the Midwest, I want to walk through these 3 threats, 2 of which I mentioned as being kind of big concerns. So this is an example of a site in southern Illinois where bats are hibernating. This is not a picture of the site itself. This is just what it looks like from above ground. So there's a hole in the ground underneath which is a cave that is massive. And to keep people from entering this cave, management people have put up a gate that covers the entrance, which is really just kind of a hole in the ground going down and then kind of straightening out. And this gate is fairly effective for the most part. However, since I've been working in Illinois, twice we've had an instance of people breaking into this cave. And even in the dead of winter, when we visited this site and I took this photo, it had just warmed up after a really, really, really cold spell. And we saw footprints going to the back of the gate where there was a place that was kind of compromised. So folks were trying to get into it right in the dead of winter, which is exactly when you don't want to be disturbing bats. I was at the site to check on an acoustic detector and change that out outside the cave, not going in during the sensitive period. This is a problem because, that people are wanting to disturb bats in the middle of the winter because bats are really at risk during this time. So you may have heard of the disease white nose syndrome, which is killing our cave hibernating bats. This is a fungus that is a novel fungus that appears to have been brought here from Europe or Asia. It's a cold-loving fungus that causes this disease, white nose syndrome, by growing on the nose, ears, and wing membranes of hibernating bats. It kind of works best at temperatures below 20 degrees Celsius, which is, not super cold, but cold enough that that's kind of the winter temperatures where bats are hibernating. It attacks when bats have reduced their body temperature to hibernate, and so they're not able to fight it off. And it doesn't need the bats around to survive, so it can actually survive in a cave environment and wait for bats to return. So once a cave has been infested by this fungus, then bats are experiencing it every winter. what happens when bats get the fungus growing on them during the winter is that they start to try to fight it off by their immune system. If it does kick in, causes holes in their wing. The fungus is also necrotic on the wing tissue, so we get damage and scarring of wings. Then as bats start to lose energy, they will fly around, perhaps try to go outside to find something to eat, but when it's really cold, there are no insects to eat. And so bats actually will deplete their fat reserves trying to fight off this fungus during the winter, and ultimately have problems with water balance, flight, and starvation as a result of being affected by this fungus. And so we've seen white nose syndrome kind of march across North America. It originally started in the East in New York, where the X is on the screen. And that was around Albany, New York, which is a show cave, Howell's Cavern, and then spread down the Appalachian mountain chain up into Nova Scotia, and then started to move across Canada. It reached here in Illinois in 2011, and it has caused devastation in some of our hibernating bat populations, but remarkably, some populations are doing pretty well. And so we're kind of trying to understand, what are the dynamics that allow some bats to persist through this, or some populations. Also, it's moved, into the Great Plains, and even all the way out to California and Washington State. And so it's just a matter of time before more species are affected. We have seen some pretty significant declines in 4 species of bats here in the eastern US. So what are folks doing to combat white nose syndrome? People always ask me this, so I decided I better put a slide in and let you know. So one critical thing, and this is kind of where I like to work, is in protecting and restoring critical habitats for cave hibernating bats, not just the places where they hibernate, but also the places where they spend the summer, so that we can make sure that these bats have the opportunity to put on their fat before they go into hibernation and be healthier, and hopefully be more able to persist through the winter. There is some evidence that, as I mentioned, some bats are persisting through the winter. So whatever we can do to kind of help shore them up, I think is a good idea. There are folks looking at a variety of disease treatments, whether biological, chemical, immunological, or genetic. We have seen evidence that bats that are surviving the fungus are genetically different than those that have died. Just limited evidence there so far, but it does suggest that some bats may have genetic adaptations that make them more likely to survive. Those are actually largely going to be behavioral. Bats that tend to try to not roost in large groups, maybe roost more separate, and therefore don't get infected by the fungus as often because they're hanging out away from other bats. But there are other things we can do, including vaccines or putting different chemicals in the environment that can help to inhibit the fungus's growth. And then mechanical changes to hibernacula, including some efforts to create artificial hibernation sites for bats that can be cleaned during the summer when the bats are gone, to prevent or control the populations of the fungus. Now, I mentioned that wind energy can be a problem for bats, and some of our bats are actually moving across the entire continent. These lines are just estimates made by my colleague Paul Cryan in a study where he used stable isotopes of hydrogen in the fur of bats to infer how they might be moving. But we actually do not have data like this the way we do for birds. Bats are incredibly difficult to observe, and it's not possible. Well, it could be possible, and I'll tell you more about that, but we have not been able to draw maps like this. This is just potential movements of bats across the continent. And when they are flying these very long distances, they're using probably the same kinds of flyways that birds are using, although again, we don't really know for sure. And now and more bats are encountering these fields of wind turbines in the areas as they migrate. And these wind turbine sites are problematic for bats for a few reasons. One, they were built in areas that were formerly forested. And then these new openings that around the turbines may be planted in grass that might be attractive places for bats to feed on insects. Turbines are also lighted, and this could also attract insects, but we're not sure on this. There's been just a little bit of work to indicate that. And then there's the last thing is that bats may be attracted to these sites if, rather than the tall trees that used to be in that space, now these turbines appear to bats to be the tall trees. And for these migratory bats that don't hibernate in caves, there is this hypothesis that they might leck the way that some birds do. So lecking is when males group together and then call to females and try to, entice them to come over to mate. And this happens with a variety of bird species. And it's possible that these bats are seeking out a place, a tall tree on the landscape that they can land in and then call to females as they're flying past. And if that's what's happening, then putting up these wind turbines in their migratory routes is going to continue to be problematic. We have found, however, that turning off the turbines in periods of low wind should reduce impacts to bats. So bats will tend to migrate through these, windy areas when the wind speeds are around 5 to 6 meters per second. Maybe even a little lower, 3 to 4 meters per second. And then if you get up to 5 to 6 meters per second, you start to see bat activity tail off. And that's because they're small. They're not powerful flyers, and high wind periods are not, as optimal for them for flying long distances. And so during those lower wind speeds, if we can turn off the turbines, turn them out of the wind, then we can actually make safe passage for bats to come through. There are also efforts to use sound to try to keep bats away from the turbines, but the sound so far has been emitted from the center or the nacelle of the turbine, and it is incredibly difficult to get high frequency sound to transmit across a really long blade and out to the tip, which is where bats are running into the blades. So thus far, we have not had great luck with deterrence, but folks are still working on that technology. Now, the last thing I want to mention is habitat loss and how that can impact bats. So most of the bats, including bats that hibernate in caves and also bats that migrate long distances, they roost in live or dead trees during the summer. This can be a variety. I mean, just about any tree that you could think of in your backyard or your neighborhood or a nearby park could be a roost for a bat, because some of them will roost under the bark of live trees or in cavities in live trees. Some will roost under the bark of dead trees, like the ones pictured on the left side here. And then some will roost in clusters of leaves, often dead leaves, but sometimes live leaves. So really, a tree is great habitat for bats. And the endangered Indiana bat, which is found across all of Illinois, uses dead trees during the summer. It's actually probably doing okay in the more forested parts of Illinois, because there is a lot of forest for them to select from. So if you look at this map here, we're seeing data from a paper done by a student I helped work with, who mapped out, the likely distribution of Indiana bats in Illinois. And her analysis shows that they're going to be found where there's forest. And where is there forest? Well, besides southern Illinois, forest tends to follow the major river corridors, including the Illinois River. And so this is where we're likely to find Indiana bats. And so while folks would like to know if they might be up closer to Cook County, thus far they're not being detected up there. And that's probably just because of the absence of major corridors of forest that they could use for roosting. So when we look across central Illinois, the forest is also still restricted to our smaller streams, very patchy forest with a lot of farmland in between, not a super hospitable site for bats, although this area around Fishhook, Illinois is one of the first places that Indiana bats were ever studied during the summer when they were using trees. So thinking about habitat, I think it's important to think about forests. I will grant that we know very little about how bats did or would use prairie habitat in Illinois, and that's something that definitely needs a lot more study. So the Midwest is actually home to 13 species of bats, and all 13 are found here in Illinois. We also have 2 accidental species over on the right. So I'll just walk you through. Can you see my mouse, Laura or Adrian?
Yes, we can see your mouse.
Okay, great. So we got big brown bat, eastern red bat, Indiana bat, tricolored bat, the hoary bat, the northern long-eared bat, the southeastern myotis, the gray bat, the small-footed bat, eastern small-footed bat, the little brown bat, the evening bat, the silver-haired bat, the Rafinesque's big-eared bat, and then on the right, the Seminole bat, Mexican free-tailed bat. There was one found in Cook County just 2 or 3 years ago. This is definitely not a normal Illinois resident, but these bats could probably get swept away on some winds. So we have fairly good diversity here in Illinois, which is kind of exciting, although I will grant that most of the species are restricted to the southern part of the state where there is more forest. When we look at bats in Illinois, the landscape has changed a bit in terms of who is endangered or threatened. And I just want to introduce you to some of the major characters. So much of the work that we've done on bats in the East has been driven by concerns about the Indiana bat, which is a federally endangered species, first listed actually when the Endangered Species Act was signed in 1973. And then the gray bat, which is in the bottom left, was also one of the early bats on the endangered species list, listed in 1976. And for those two species, they were the ones that drove most of the survey work for bats in the East until 2015, when, due to declines from white nose syndrome, the northern long-eared bat was listed as federally threatened. And it was experiencing tremendous declines. Used to be the most common bat that any of us caught. And it was very common in forested areas to the west of Chicago as well. But with white nose syndrome declined so much that it was first listed as threatened, and then this year it was upgraded to endangered. The little brown bat, which is a close cousin to those first three, is under review for listing right now, potentially as federally endangered. It's an interesting one, though, because it is found across much of North America, so it has a really wide distribution. It's also found in Canada. And it is doing well in some places, not very many though, frankly, and probably merits some listing, but it's a tricky one because it also is a bat that people will find in their houses. It's kind of a nuisance species in some places, and so that's something that the feds will have to contend with in terms of thinking about how to handle it once it's listed. The tricolored bat is another one. I did see a few tricolored bats in the mine in the that I was in this morning, but tricolored bats have declined pretty rapidly as a result of white nose syndrome and are under review for federal listing, and maybe will be listed in just next month in October. That's the current plan, but we still haven't heard the final word. Other species that are at risk include the hoary bat and the eastern red bat. So the hoary bat I already mentioned as being at risk from wind energy, and the red bat is the same, and possibly also from habitat loss. Both of these species are long distance flyers that presumably move across the continent, north to south, right now as they move to warmer habitats for winter, and then move back across in the north, or to the north in the spring. Neither of these species has received any formal consideration by the federal government, but they are both potentially experiencing population level declines. It's challenging, however, because since these bats don't aggregate anywhere, we can't actually tell, how their populations are doing. Now, two species in Illinois that are stable or potentially increasing include the evening bat and the big brown bat. Both of these bats are adapted to using human-made structures, including bat boxes and buildings, although historically they probably both relied on cavities in large dead trees. But they are doing well, and if you see a bat flying over your backyard in Cook County, it is very likely to be a big brown bat, first and foremost. The other species could fly over, but big browns are doing well in many areas, and it's the bat that I see most often in buildings. So what can you do to help bats? Well, of course, educate other people. So hopefully you'll share some of the knowledge that you have gotten from me today, or any readings that you might do on bats. And protecting and enhancing natural areas can be very important, and I'll delve into that a little bit more in just a minute. I do think it's important to think about bats year-round. Limiting human disturbance, as Adrian said, thinking about the night sky and how much light is in the sky, especially during the migratory period, can be important for not only bats, but also migratory birds. And then conserving energy is really vital if we're going to reduce our reliance on, dirty sources of energy like coal, but also even on clean sources of energy like wind turbines, which can be devastating to bats. Now, you might be wondering about bat boxes. People often ask me about bat boxes, and this is actually one of my major areas of research. So I just want to touch on this briefly. Should you be providing artificial roost habitat for bats in your backyard? Well, I would offer up that bat boxes are not always effective as conservation tools, sometimes because even well-meaning people can build structures that ultimately degrade into pretty low quality habitat, but for a variety of other reasons too. For example, many bat boxes offer unsuitably hot or cold temperatures, and this is due to a combination of things like being too small, which is very common for bat boxes that you see. If you see a bat box in a store, it's almost certainly too small. You usually need to build your own box in order to make one that's big enough to offer a good color or a good temperature gradient. Poor color choice. Generally, black is a very bad idea for a bat box, although that is the most common advice you'll get on the internet about what color to paint your bat or your box. And both of these can lead to bat deaths. So bats could freeze in boxes or they can overheat. Here's what happens in a bat box, which is just a small wooden structure, usually exposed to full sun across the course of a day. In the morning, as bats choose that roost, they may see a slight temperature gradient, say from 75 to 79 degrees Fahrenheit from bottom to top. And so it looks like a cozy place, maybe a little bit warmer than the outside air temperature at dawn. But by the end of the day, the bats are now experiencing 100 degrees Fahrenheit at the bottom and 126 degrees Fahrenheit at the top. And that could be okay if the structure is holding only 1 or 2 bats because they could just hang out at the bottom. But if you pack 300 in there, then some bats are going to get trapped at the top. And that's where we get overheating and bat deaths, which I have definitely seen. So the length or the height of the box is a critical feature, and I always encourage people to build longer boxes that give bats more space to roost and also to move around to the temperatures that they desire. In addition to those overheating or underheating concerns, bat boxes may increase bats' exposure to predators because they're often deployed in really conspicuous locations. And then we have seen accumulations of bat bugs in bat boxes. So I'm a little concerned that they may be harboring these parasites over the winter and having bats be unnecessarily exposed to those in the summer, whereas a dead tree that a bat might use is probably not good from year to year to year, so less likely to accumulate parasites. These structures could also draw bats to low quality habitats, such as the box in the top picture, which is deployed in the middle of a grassy field where there's nowhere easy for bats to forage. And we do also have some concerns that bats might lose their search image for natural roosts, albeit in Cook County, where there may be less natural roosting habitat. Bat boxes might be the only type of roost that would support a colony of bats, but we do need to do a better job of producing quality artificial roost habitat for bats if that's what we're going to do. So some good scenarios, I think, for deploying bat boxes would be where a colony is already established and using human-made roosts. For example, if the bats are infesting a building and someone wants to get them out, then a bat box might be a good alternative. I think, looking at areas where there's good high quality foraging habitat where bats can find insects to eat is important. And then also still thinking about restoring natural habitats to just use bat boxes as a bridge to bats using natural habitat, not drawing them to places that are low quality. Now, I think that I would be remiss to try to tell you all what plants you should plant for insects, because I think that's something you think about quite a lot. But this is a list of plants that we have, by we, I mean bat biologists have put together, that are plants that will feed insects that bats will eat, right? Really thinking about butterflies, but more so moths and beetles and flies, but all sorts of other arthropods as well. Anything that might be active at night or evident at night for bats to take off of vegetation could be important. And I think we could probably extend this list, but when you're considering planting in your yards or areas where you work, I hope you will also not only look at your daytime active insects, but also your nighttime insects to see what kind of plants you could plant that would support both, because then you will be helping to feed bats. And just like so many things about bats, we really don't understand how bats respond to planting native plants. Something that I'm particularly interested in, but have not figured out how to study, is how to discern the impact of all the native planting that goes on in backyards and front yards all over Illinois. Does that have an impact on bats? Could we show a positive effect? I don't know, but I wonder if we could, and I think it'd be interesting to try to design a study that found that bats were benefiting from these native plantings. It's always a good idea to plant an oak tree, right? Because you're probably familiar with the work of Doug Tallamy, who has shown that an oak tree can support almost 500 different species of moths, and then, of course, a host of other insects, including bugs and flies and beetles. So oak trees are excellent habitat for bats in terms of foraging. And then, of course, an oak tree can also be roosting habitat for bats that may want to roost in the foliage, or use a cavity in the tree, or use the tree once it has died. Incidentally, we were able to show in my lab that bats are actually beneficial to oaks. So my student Liz Bielke did this really interesting experiment where she put these plots up in the forest. This was done on state forest land in south central Indiana. And she had control plots, and then she had bat excluded plots. The control plots just had kind of a frame, but no netting. But the bat excluded plots had netting that she would close at night to keep bats out, and then open during the day, thereby allowing birds to come and go and do whatever ecosystem services they wanted to offer, but not allowing bats access. And by doing this over the course of 3 summers with 20 different plots, Liz was able to show that where bats are excluded, that we see 5 to 6 times more defoliation of oak and hickory saplings by insects, therefore showing that bats are really beneficial. If bats have access, they can reduce that defoliation. And you can see with the plot on the right that the percent defoliation difference was actually higher for oaks than for hickories, suggesting that bats may play a role in forest composition by controlling pests of oaks that would otherwise keep those saplings from making it up to adulthood. So lastly, I want to talk about some things that we're doing to help bats using technology. So bats are way ahead of us in terms of technology. Their abilities are unparalleled. Being able to fly at night and capture insects in the sky is just, pretty awesome, right? And it's taken us a long time to catch up to try to study them. And we're still not able to do things like track them across vast areas due to limitations in technology, but we're getting there. But one thing that we have started to do is to try to map their distributions across space and time using a standardized approach. And we're working on a continental database across all of North America with this program called the North American Bat Monitoring Program. And the idea is that we're going to collect data in a systematic way across all of North America, and then do these annual status and trends analyses that will help us to better understand how our bat populations are doing. So I am the leader of one of these hubs, the Midwest Bat Hub. We have responsibility for the 8 states pictured here in blue, and there are other hubs either formed or being formed across the rest of North America. In our Midwest Bat Hub, which is based at the University of Illinois, we work with agency partners from state agencies, federal agencies, and also volunteers to collect data. We support with some data processing and uploads, and we're trying to train folks up to gather more bat acoustic data, and then trying to support regional bat conservation efforts. So if you're familiar with the eBird program run out of Cornell University, eBird has citizen or community scientists running around all over the world, really, myself included, collecting data for them. And that's because people have trained themselves to identify birds and then are going out and listening and looking for birds and submitting data to eBird. And there are far more bird species to count than there are bats. So I think that with additional training, we may be able to get more folks on board to help us with bat acoustic monitoring. So with acoustic monitoring, we are often sending bat detectors out to folks to have them deploy on a post or on the light post in their yard or on the edge of their shed, as you can see in these pictures. And then these detectors are actually recording the echolocation calls of bats. And this is not, the necessarily the simplest, but of some of the things that we can do, it's something that any person could do with the right training and equipment. You don't have to handle bats in order to record their echolocation calls. And so we take the data from the bat detector, get thousands of files, we identify them using software, and we can spit out bar graphs like the one at the bottom right that show, what are the bats that were recorded at this site. And this is actual data from Illinois. So you can see that the big brown bat was dominant. Second was the eastern red bat. And this gives us a sense of, who is in the bat community at a site, what is the relative abundance, and how does that change over space and time. So in Illinois, we have been working with volunteers using the NA bat framework. So the state is actually gridded up into these squares that are 10 by 10 kilometers on a side. And so just picture the entire state is covered in squares. And here we're showing the squares where we have been monitoring. This is data from 2022. And we have randomly selected the priority sites in the state. And those are outlined in black. And we're getting data in some priority cells, but we're also getting a bunch of data in non-priority cells. Since we're working across an 8-state area, we would like to work in the priority cells first. And so that's where we're putting our efforts mostly now in 2023, but we are catching or kind of recording up to 445 bat call files per night. So some sites are particularly productive, especially over along the Mississippi River. And we're getting between 3 and 10 bat species per site with these acoustic detectors. It's not 100% accurate. There are some problems with bat call ID, but luckily that technology continues to improve as well. And we will get better and better at identifying our bat calls. So I just want to share with you some data on 3 species here in Illinois to show you kind of what we're looking at. Actually, it's a picture of a big brown bat in flight. Isn't it cute? But then I'm just showing you data for all bat species. And so the darkest red cells actually show you where we're getting the most activity. And I think it's pretty interesting that we're getting fairly good activity west of Chicago and also over along the Mississippi River. And then as you follow the Illinois River corridor, we get good activity there too. So some spots that maybe you wouldn't necessarily expect are some of our higher activity sites in the state. And it'll be interesting to see how our data look here in 2023. We're still processing it. It takes quite a bit of time to process so that we can, see how these sites rank from one year to the next. When we look at a couple of our sensitive species, so on the left is the Indiana bat, and on the right is the little brown bat. Remember, those are both bats that are affected by white nose syndrome, and the Indiana bat is federally endangered. We actually have pretty good data for the Indiana bat, kind of extending, in a corridor from about Springfield west over towards the Mississippi River. And there's a really important hibernation site for Indiana bats just west of Quincy over in Hannibal, Missouri, that has 215,000 of those little guys hibernating during the winter. So that could explain this strong band of activity for the Indiana bat here. But as I mentioned, not so common up here in Chicagoland, and really shouldn't be because of the lack of forest. So it's not surprising that we're not recording them there. The little brown bat, on the other hand, used to be more common in this region. It's a bat that's more tied to water and likes to forage over rivers and large streams. And so it makes sense that we're picking it up along the Mississippi River here, relatively close to the Illinois River, and then kind of continuing down that corridor. These detections here around Chicagoland are interesting, and I think bear maybe further investigation because it's a bat that is not doing well in many parts of its range. And so it could be curious to know why we're recording so many around Chicago. So this is an example of how technology can kind of help us to learn more about bats. And We do accept folks to volunteer for this program, but I will say we're at kind of capacity in Illinois. However, if you're interested, I would encourage you to reach out, because never know when somebody's going to drop out and we're going to want to be seeking out a new volunteer. So, and then ultimately, I think down the line, be thinking about how we might be able to implement that technology in everyone's backyard, right? And how amazing it would be to have those data. So just like eBird, we could be collecting a lot more data on bat species presence and activity levels as we continue to get less expensive bat detectors and better technology for identifying their calls. So with that, I want to stop talking now so I can take any questions that you might have, but I'll leave this up on the screen. If you want to contact me, you're more than welcome to ask me questions about bats. And thanks so much for listening and for your interest in bats.